It's got a plot we all know about. We all know the story of Ahab and the white whale, even if we haven't read a word of it. But the frustrating thing can be is that as he tells the story, it's almost like he willfully doesn't want to tell the story. He will insert chapters, sidebars, about things that seem completely irrelevant. And what I have found is, as at least I get older, and it really wasn't until I was the age that Melville was when he wrote this book. He was 31 when he wrote Moby Dick. He had spent a couple of years as a whaleman in the South Pacific, so he really knew of what he wrote. And then he went through, once he came back, he went through a period of intense artistic development. His first book about his experiences in the South Seas, Taipei, in which he recounted how he jumped ship and went to live with the cannibals in the Marquesas. Completely, this was a potboiler that was a big bestseller, and it would be the most popular book he would ever write. And as a writer, it's a tough one when that first book is, you never quite get back to it. And that was Melville's curse to a certain extent. But in those next 5 years, he rediscovered the canon of American literature and English literature. He rediscovered, he started reading Shakespeare really for the first time seriously in his late 20s. His eyes were an issue for him early on, in part probably because the sun damage inflicted as a whaleman. And so he preferred books with big type. And so he got a wonderful edition of Shakespeare with big type, and he just dove into Shakespeare and completely internalized it. Milton, he did the same thing. Virgil, all of this was happening in the 5 years after he returned from whaling. And then it came to the summer of 1850. He was on vacation in the Berkshires with his family. He had family, an uncle who had a place up there. It was a place that he loved. Some of his happiest childhood memories were of the Berkshires. And it was in August of 1850 that he, on a picnic up to Monument Mountain, that he met Nathaniel Hawthorne. And by this point, he thought he had finished a novel about a whaling novel. From the letters we have related to it, it sounded like a fairly sort of picaresque novel, a fairly conventional novel. But then he meets Hawthorne, and during a shower of rain, they talk to one another. And this has a transformative experience for Melville. And he would take up Hawthorne's short story collection, and bang, he discovered what he called the power of blackness in Hawthorne. And he basically jumped what he had done, or at least tore up the foundation of that house he had built, and completely reinvented it with under the kind of spell of Hawthorne. And they would see each other, and he also decided to move his family from New York to the Berkshires. So here he goes, he moves his family as one child at this point, but it's an extended family. His mother, who is a widower, is often living with him. He's got some sisters. And he buys a house in the Berkshires, and they move out there, and by November, he's out there, and he begins to rework Moby Dick. And he goes through an intense period of writing. In a novel he would write after Moby Dick called Pierre, he would describe how he would go up about 9:30, after breakfast, begin writing. Someone would knock on the door with lunch, which he would regularly ignore, and it was 4 or 5 o'clock before he stopped, and would sit there in what he described as a mesmeric state. And he did this day after day until his eyes, that had always been a problem, really began to bother him. And in Pierre, he describes how they would hurt so much that he would have to squint and could barely see the page as he was writing. And so he was in a very Ahab phase of monomania while he was creating this book. And by the spring, he was approaching the end, and then he took 3 weeks off to put the crops in at their house in the Berkshires. And he apparently had that final 3 chapters, one of the greatest action sequences ever written ahead of him. And he plunged into that, and then during the summer of 1850, pushed Moby Dick through the press, and it was published in November of 1851. And it was not a critical success, it was not a popular success, but Nathaniel Hawthorne, to whom the novel was dedicated, said that, clear, we don't have the letter Hawthorne wrote, but clearly judging from Melville's response, he really liked it. And for Melville, that was more than enough. And in the pages of Moby Dick, I think that in this book I talk about that writerly relationship the two had. But why read this book? Well, Melville was writing at a very important time in American history. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had just been passed, which meant that a slave escaping from the South, if found in the North, had to be returned to his slave masters in the South. And this meant that suddenly slavery was no longer kind of a local issue. Everyone was pulled into it. And Melville's father-in-law was a judge in Boston who got caught up in some of the first legal ramifications of this. And so it was a time of riots and real social unrest in Boston. And Melville was, and this was all happening while he was working on this novel. And so all of the passions that would ultimately, 10 years later, erupt in the Civil War were there while Melville was working on this novel. And they're as much a part of this novel as Shakespeare and Hawthorne. And as a consequence, imprinted in this book is so much of what America is about, particularly a country on the verge of a cataclysm. And today we seem to have a cataclysm around the corner all the time. And I think this is one of the reasons why this novel continues to resonate. Whenever we're finding ourselves at a time of crisis, someone can find a parallel in Moby Dick, whether it was let's say the BP oil crisis in the Gulf. There was a column that appeared in the New York Times comparing Ahab's quest for oil, the whale oil, to BP. Of course, in World War II, Ahab and Hitler. And now we've got a lot of Middle Eastern dictators that can be fruitfully compared to what happened to Ahab. And so this novel has in it so much of what we are about as a country. And reading a book that is timeless means that you get it's interesting. You get a very specific sense of what it is like to be alive, not only in your time but in another time. And it's Melville's ability to take the absolute specifics of his own time and then make them resonate with a very different world that I think is part of why we read Moby Dick. And I'm just going to sort of dip into the book a little bit. Okay, so why read Moby Dick? Well, contained in the pages of Moby Dick is nothing less than the genetic code of America. All the promises, problems, conflicts, and ideals that contributed to the outbreak of a revolution in 1775, as well as a civil war in 1861, and continue to drive this country's ever-contentious march into the future. This means that whenever a new crisis grips this country, Moby Dick becomes newly important. It is why subsequent generations have seen Ahab as Hitler during World War II, or as a profit-crazed deep drilling oil company in 2010, or as a power-crazed Middle Eastern dictator in 2011. And the other thing that it contains, as I said earlier, I think it's a book that you should come to with some life experience. I've read it, I think, close to a dozen times. And the works of nonfiction that I write require 75% of my time to be reading and researching. And often I'm reading stuff that is not literary in any form. And what I will do, for example, the book I wrote before this, The Last Stand, about the Battle of Little Bighorn, and I've done this with all my books, is that whenever I'm feeling like I need a shot of something, I will dip into Moby Dick and read perhaps just a paragraph, but there's something about the mojo of this novel that I find a breath of fresh air. The other thing, for me, I've had the tortured relationship I mentioned earlier. I moved to Nantucket, the holy ground of Moby Dick, 25 years ago in 1986. It was my wife's job that brought us there. It was not any need to follow Ishmael. But I was a big fan of Moby Dick, and I was really excited about moving there. And then I discovered a year or two later that Melville had never been to Nantucket when he wrote there. He had met Nantucketers, but the chapter he has, chapter 14, Nantucket, is just, it's the greatest 5-paragraph tour de force you're going to find anywhere. And he's not a journalist telling you about Nantucket. He is a poet whose artistry is creating a mythic place. And he had seen Nantucketers, and he knew what Nantucket was about. But the reason Ishmael goes there is not because Nantucket's the biggest whaling port, because it wasn't by this point. It was the first